China had calculated that its naval presence in the Black Sea would demonstrate unshakable alliance with Russia. However, within 72 hours of Turkey's announcement, every Chinese warship vanished from the region without explanation. This was not a routine repositioning or scheduled maintenance withdrawal. This represents the first time in modern history that Beijing has abandoned a strategic commitment under direct pressure from a NATO member, revealing fractures in the Russia-China axis that Western intelligence had predicted but never witnessed so dramatically. The implications extend far beyond the Black Sea, signaling a fundamental recalculation in Beijing's willingness to sacrifice economic relationships for geopolitical posturing. The images you are about to see on your screens will document one of the most significant naval retreats in recent maritime history. What you see is not just ships changing position on a map. The footage shows the systematic dismantling of what Chinese state media had celebrated as permanent strategic presence. In the images that will appear on your screen shortly, satellite tracking data confirms the complete absence of Chinese naval assets from Black Sea waters for the first time since February 2024. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are three critical factors that forced Beijing's hand and shattered the illusion of unbreakable Sino-Russian partnership. We will explain this in the later parts of the video. Now we must look at how this crisis began. On March 12, 2026, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan delivered an unprecedented ultimatum during closed-door NATO consultations in Brussels. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, Fidan presented intelligence documentation proving that Chinese naval vessels operating in the Black Sea had provided targeting data and electronic warfare support to Russian forces conducting strikes on Ukrainian grain infrastructure. The evidence, which included intercepted communications and geolocated satellite imagery, demonstrated direct Chinese military participation in operations that violated international maritime law and threatened global food security. Turkey, as the guardian of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits under the 1936 Montreux Convention, possessed unique authority to regulate warship passage through these critical choke points. The Turkish ultimatum was precise and non-negotiable. Chinese naval forces had 48 hours to exit the Black Sea voluntarily or face permanent exclusion from strait transit rights. This was not diplomatic posturing. Turkey backed its demand with immediate deployment of coastal defense batteries along the Bosphorus, including upgraded Atmaka anti-ship missiles with 220-kilometer range and German-supplied Iris-T air defense systems. The message was unmistakable. Any Chinese vessel attempting forced passage would face engagement by a NATO member operating within its sovereign territorial waters. According to German intelligence reports shared with alliance partners, Turkey had coordinated this action with the United States, United Kingdom, and France, ensuring unified Western response to any Chinese escalation. Beijing faced an impossible choice. Defying the ultimatum meant direct military confrontation with a NATO member, potentially triggering Article 5 collective defense obligations. This would transform a regional dispute into a global crisis while exposing Chinese naval forces to catastrophic losses in confined waters, where they possessed no tactical advantage. Compliance meant public humiliation and acknowledgement that China's commitment to Russia carried limits that pressure could expose. Within 36 hours, Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman Colonel Wu Qian issued a terse statement announcing temporary redeployment of naval assets for maintenance and training exercises in the eastern Mediterranean. Satellite imagery confirmed the lie. Every Chinese warship transited the Bosphorus heading south, then scattered across multiple ports from Syria to Sri Lanka, avoiding any concentrated formation that might suggest coordinated operations. The technical execution of this withdrawal revealed Beijing's desperation. Chinese naval doctrine emphasizes deliberate planning and coordinated movements that project strength and discipline. The March 2026 exodus resembled panicked evacuation rather than professional redeployment. The Type 052D destroyer Kunming, flagship of the Black Sea Detachment, departed Novorossiysk under cover of darkness on March 13th without the ceremonial protocols that typically accompany such movements. According to Radio Free Europe reporters monitoring the strait, the vessel transited at maximum safe speed with minimal crew visible on deck. Two Type 054A frigates followed within hours, maintaining radio silence throughout passage. The frigate Yancheng suffered minor collision damage to its port side while navigating the Bosphorus currents, suggesting rushed departure without proper pilot coordination. Most revealing was the abandonment of the Type 903A replenishment ship Luomahu, which Chinese naval planners had positioned in the Black Sea specifically to enable extended operations independent of foreign port access. This vessel represented hundreds of millions of dollars in logistics capability and months of operational planning. Its hasty withdrawal, loaded with supplies intended to sustain operations through summer 2026, demonstrated that Beijing had concluded no face-saving excuse could justify remaining under Turkish ultimatum. The Luo Mahu's departure meant Chinese surface combatants operating in adjacent regions would face critical resupply limitations, constraining their operational radius and strategic flexibility across the entire Mediterranean theater. The strategic implications cascade across multiple domains simultaneously. China had positioned naval forces in the Black Sea to accomplish three objectives: demonstrate solidarity with Russia despite Western sanctions, establish precedent for Chinese military presence in European waters, and develop operational experience for future blue water deployments. The forced withdrawal shatters all three objectives while exposing Beijing to accusations of weakness from nationalistic domestic audiences that Chinese state media had conditioned to expect assertive foreign policy. This represents the first major reversal of China's naval expansion since Xi Jinping initiated the Belt and Road Maritime Component in 2013. The psychological impact within People's Liberation Army Navy circles cannot be overstated. An officer corps trained to project confidence in China's destiny as dominant maritime power must now process the reality that a single NATO member wielding geographic leverage achieved what the entire American Pacific Fleet could not accomplish through direct confrontation. The economic calculations behind Beijing's capitulation reveal the true hierarchy of Chinese strategic priorities. Turkey controls not just strait access, but critical infrastructure nodes connecting China's Belt and Road Initiative across Eurasia and the Middle East. Turkish construction firms manage approximately $47 billion in active projects across China's western provinces, while Chinese manufacturers depend on Turkish logistics networks for European market access. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Beijing conducted rapid assessment of costs associated with Turkish antagonism and concluded that Black Sea naval presence provided insufficient value to justify endangering these economic relationships. Trade volume between Turkey and China reached $89 billion in 2025, making Turkey China's largest trading partner in the Middle East and a critical bridge to European markets facing increasing protectionist barriers against direct Chinese exports. This cost-benefit analysis exposes fundamental constraints on Chinese military assertiveness that Western strategists had theorized but never witnessed so clearly. Beijing's willingness to sacrifice prestige for economic pragmatism suggests that China's leadership, despite rhetorical commitment to multipolarity and resistance to American hegemony, remains primarily focused on domestic economic stability and growth metrics that justify Communist Party legitimacy. The humiliating naval withdrawal indicates that when forced to choose between geopolitical posturing and concrete economic interests, Xi Jinping's administration consistently prioritizes the latter. This creates exploitable pressure points for Western policymakers seeking to constrain Chinese military adventurism without direct confrontation. The geopolitical context extends far beyond immediate bilateral Turkey-China tensions. NATO members watching this crisis unfold have absorbed critical lesson about alliance unity and economic leverage application. Turkey's unilateral action, backed by quiet American and European coordination, demonstrated that collective Western pressure can fracture the Russia-China axis despite years of increasingly formal partnership declarations. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which both Moscow and Beijing promote as counterweight to NATO, provided no meaningful support to China during this crisis. Neither Russia nor any Central Asian member state offered alternative port access or diplomatic backing that might have allowed Beijing to save face. This silence speaks volumes about the shallow foundations underlying authoritarian alliance structures built on opposition to the West, rather than genuine shared interests. The timing of Turkey's move reveals sophisticated understanding of Chinese vulnerabilities and Russian constraints. Moscow, facing catastrophic losses in Ukraine and severe economic sanctions, desperately needs visible Chinese support to sustain domestic narrative about Russia's continued great power status. However, Russia's weakness prevents it from offering China any reciprocal protection against Turkish pressure. Putin cannot risk antagonizing Turkey, which controls critical energy transit routes and maintains pragmatic relationship with Russia despite NATO membership. This asymmetric dependent structure means China supported Russia's Ukraine invasion at growing cost while receiving negligible strategic benefit. The Black Sea humiliation forces Beijing's foreign policy establishment to question whether alignment with declining Russian power serves Chinese national interests or merely satisfies Xi Jinping's ideological preferences. The historical parallels to this moment are striking and ominous for Beijing. In 1938, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, presenting united front against Soviet communism and Western democracies. Within 3 years, the alliance had fractured as each power pursued contradictory objectives that cooperation could not reconcile. Germany's focus on European conquest conflicted with Japan's Pacific expansion, while both discovered that authoritarian partnerships lack the institutional mechanisms democracies employ to resolve disputes and coordinate strategy. The Russia-China relationship exhibits similar structural fragilities. Moscow needs Chinese economic support and diplomatic cover. Beijing seeks Russian natural resources and geopolitical distraction that divides Western attention between European and Pacific theaters. These complementary needs create appearance of strategic alignment, but the relationship lacks depth to survive serious pressure testing. Now we must examine the human dimension of this crisis and the psychological impact rippling through Chinese military and political circles. Within the People's Liberation Army Navy Officer Corps, the Black Sea withdrawal has triggered intense debate about leadership decision-making and strategic competence. According to leaked assessments circulating on Chinese military forums that Western intelligence monitors closely, junior officers question why naval assets were committed to indefensible positions without securing guaranteed transit rights or contingency planning for political reversals. The criticism remains carefully phrased to avoid direct challenge to civilian leadership, but the underlying frustration is unmistakable. A service branch that prides itself on professionalism and technical excellence must now process the reality that political considerations forced acceptance of humiliating operational defeat. Senior Chinese military officials face even more uncomfortable questions from Communist Party leadership, demanding explanation for how this debacle occurred. Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun, who personally approved the Black Sea deployment as demonstration of China's global reach, now confronts scrutiny about risk assessment failures and insufficient contingency planning. The admiral's position, already weakened by ongoing anti-corruption investigations targeting military procurement, faces additional pressure as Xi Jinping's inner circle seeks accountability for this very public setback. According to Politico analysis of Chinese leadership dynamics, Dong Jun has canceled multiple scheduled appearances and delegated routine functions to subordinates, suggesting internal review of his performance and potential reassignment. The psychological impact extends beyond military circles into broader Chinese strategic community. Think tank analysts and academic researchers who championed assertive foreign policy and predicted inevitable Chinese dominance now must reconcile these predictions with observable reality of Turkish leverage and Western coordination frustrating Beijing's objectives. The cognitive dissonance creates space for alternative voices within Chinese policy debates, particularly economists and technocrats who have long argued that premature military assertiveness antagonizes trading partners and threatens the stable international environment that Chinese development requires. These voices, marginalized during Xi Jinping's consolidation of power and emphasis on national rejuvenation rhetoric, may gain influence as leadership confronts costs of ideologically driven foreign policy divorced from pragmatic cost-benefit analysis. For ordinary Chinese citizens consuming state media narratives about their nation's rise and inevitable status as preeminent global power, the Black Sea withdrawal creates jarring contradiction between propaganda and reality. Chinese social media, despite heavy censorship, shows traces of public questioning about why their powerful navy fled before Turkish ultimatum. Nationalist commentators who typically celebrate Chinese strength struggle to frame this outcome as anything but defeat, resorting to weak explanations about strategic patience and long-term planning that fail to satisfy audiences conditioned to expect immediate assertion of Chinese interests. The Communist Party's legitimacy rests partly on delivering nationalist pride alongside economic prosperity. When foreign policy humiliations contradict the strength narrative, public confidence in leadership competence erodes in ways economic growth alone cannot restore. The Russian reaction to China's withdrawal reveals Moscow's own desperation and shrinking options. Russian state media initially ignored the crisis entirely, then offered muted acknowledgement framed as routine redeployment, having no strategic significance. This tepid response betrays Russia's inability to either defend its primary partner or acknowledge the relationship's fragility. Putin cannot admit that China abandoned Russia under pressure without undermining the entire narrative about multipolar world order and resistance to Western hegemony. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov's eventual statement praising Chinese flexibility and strategic wisdom rang hollow to observers who recognize this as damage control rather than genuine support. Russia needed Chinese naval presence in the Black Sea as a visible symbol of great power backing. That symbol's removal leaves Moscow more isolated than at any point since the Ukraine invasion began. The future projections emerging from this crisis suggest accelerating divergence between Russian and Chinese strategic trajectories. Beijing has learned that association with Russia carries mounting costs in relationships with economically vital partners like Turkey and the European Union. This lesson will likely manifest in more careful calibration of visible support for Russian actions, maintaining rhetorical solidarity while avoiding concrete commitments that risk economic retaliation. China may continue purchasing Russian energy at discounted prices and providing diplomatic cover in international forums, but expect to see reduced Chinese willingness to extend military cooperation or financial support that might trigger Western sanctions. The pragmatic calculation that produced Black Sea withdrawal will increasingly govern Chinese decision-making regarding Russia partnership. For Western strategists, this crisis provides actionable template for constraining Chinese military expansion without direct confrontation. Turkey's successful application of geographic leverage and economic pressure demonstrates that China's authoritarian system, despite centralized decision-making and nationalist rhetoric, remains responsive to costs that threaten core economic interests. The United States and allied nations can replicate this model across multiple domains, identifying pressure points where Chinese commitments to problematic partners conflict with Beijing's dependence on Western-dominated economic systems and trade routes. The key insight is that China's leadership prioritizes regime stability and economic performance over ideological consistency, creating exploitable contradictions between revolutionary rhetoric and pragmatic governance. The military implications for potential Taiwan scenarios warrant serious consideration. If China proves unwilling to accept costs associated with maintaining naval presence in the Black Sea against Turkish pressure, how will Beijing respond to far more severe costs associated with amphibious invasion of Taiwan against American, Japanese, and allied resistance? The Black Sea withdrawal suggests Chinese military planners conduct sober assessments of probable costs versus achievable gains rather than pursuing objectives based purely on nationalist sentiment or ideological commitment. This rational calculation offers some reassurance against worst-case scenarios while highlighting the importance of maintaining credible deterrence that raises Taiwan invasion costs beyond levels Beijing would accept. The coming months will reveal whether this crisis represents isolated incident or harbinger of broader Russia-China relationship deterioration. Watch for Chinese behavior in upcoming international forums, particularly votes in United Nations Security Council regarding Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. Observe Chinese energy purchase patterns and whether Beijing continues absorbing Russian oil and gas at current volumes or begins diversifying away from overdependence on sanctioned Russian supplies. Monitor Chinese naval deployment patterns and whether Black Sea withdrawal correlates with reduced presence in other regions where Chinese forces face potential confrontation with Western interests. These indicators will demonstrate whether Beijing has fundamentally reassessed costs of Russia partnership or merely accepted tactical setback while maintaining strategic alignment. The Black Sea crisis also creates opportunities for Western diplomacy to exploit emerging Russia-China tensions. Quiet outreach to Chinese economic and foreign policy moderates, offering pathways to improved relations contingent on reduced support for Russian aggression, may find more receptive audience after Beijing's humiliating retreat demonstrated costs of authoritarian axis alignment. The European Union, despite internal divisions, showed surprising unity in backing Turkey's action against Chinese naval presence. This solidarity suggests potential for sustained coordinated pressure if Chinese leadership calculates that Russia partnership provides diminishing returns against mounting economic and diplomatic costs. What began as Chinese demonstration of global reach and solidarity with Russia has transformed into case study of authoritarian alliance fragility and economic leverage effectiveness. Turkey's ultimatum exposed the shallow foundations underlying Beijing's support for Moscow, revealing that when confronted with genuine costs, China's leadership chooses pragmatic retreat over ideological commitment. The naval vessels that vanished from the Black Sea represent more than tactical repositioning. They symbolize the limits of Chinese assertiveness when confronted by coordinated Western pressure exploiting geographic and economic dependencies that authoritarian regimes cannot easily escape. The precedent established here will resonate across future geopolitical confrontations. Nations considering Chinese partnership now possess clear evidence that Beijing's commitments carry conditions and limitations that pressure can expose. Partners cannot rely on Chinese support when maintaining that support threatens core Chinese economic interests. This creates strategic opening for Western powers to fragment authoritarian cooperation by identifying and exploiting contradictions between solidarity rhetoric and pragmatic calculation. The Black Sea withdrawal proved that China's rise, despite impressive military modernization and economic growth, remains constrained by dependencies that sophisticated pressure can leverage. Russia, watching its primary partner retreat under NATO member pressure, confronts the reality of diminishing international support and shrinking strategic options. Moscow cannot compel Chinese presence or punish Chinese withdrawal without acknowledging weakness that undermines domestic propaganda about Russia's continued great power status. This trap leaves Putin with rhetorical commitment to partnership lacking substance, as China increasingly calibrates support to avoid costs rather than maximizing assistance to struggling ally. The irony is profound. Russia's Ukraine invasion, intended to demonstrate strength and reverse post-Cold War decline, has instead accelerated isolation and exposed the emptiness of authoritarian alliances built on opposition to the West rather than genuine shared interests. As satellite imagery confirms the continued absence of Chinese warships from Black Sea waters, analysts worldwide reassess previous assumptions about authoritarian bloc cohesion and Chinese willingness to sacrifice economic interests for geopolitical posturing. The answer is clear. When forced to choose between maintaining face and protecting prosperity, Beijing chooses prosperity. This fundamental insight provides foundation for Western strategy that can constrain Chinese adventurism without military confrontation, applying pressure at points where costs exceed Chinese tolerance while benefits provide insufficient justification for escalation. Don't forget to share your thoughts on this development in the comments section. Do you think Turkey's action marks a turning point in the Russia-China relationship, or will Beijing find ways to restore its Black Sea presence? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. China set out to demonstrate unshakable partnership with Russia. Today, Beijing finds itself executing humiliating retreat under pressure from a single NATO member, revealing that the authoritarian axis fractures when confronted by coordinated Western leverage. The warships that vanished from the Black Sea carry with them the illusion of limitless Chinese commitment to Russian partnership. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.